Chris Johnson always knew she wanted to serve her country and meet the right partner to serve beside.
You know, he was the epitome of duty on her country, someone that you can trust.
Chris and Jim were going to have an absolutely wonderful life together.
What if the person you believed in most betrayed you?
You know, my gut kept saying something was off.
What if they'd betrayed everybody?
He could do whatever the hell he wanted.
He knew that he's possibly facing a court-martial.
Taking a stand could cost everything.
She was put in a real terrible situation and had to make some hard choices.
I just feared everything.
I couldn't believe that Colonel Johnson would do this.
Because I'm the one that blew the whistle.
That's when everything started to blow up, actually.
I fled. I didn't know at that point what he was capable of. So, the young me, wow. As a kid, I was a tomboy. I was always a competitive athlete. In my teen years, I was in beauty pageants, and I was Miss New York Teenager. The Army always attracted me. And then in college, I decided to join Army or ROTC.
Chris is thriving in college. There's only one drawback.
Mount St. Mary was almost, at that time, almost all women.
Just 9 miles south on the banks of the Hudson River is another college. This one, almost all men.
West Point United States Military Academy is the place where serious cadets go to become career or professional officers.
On Halloween night in 1985, Chris and her girlfriends make an impromptu visit.
We went trick-or-treating in the barracks at West Point. You know, we weren't supposed to be there, but here we were, and Jim was the cadet company commander, and I had dressed up as a baby, and so I had a baby bottle and a blanket. Jim was sitting at his desk studying, trying to ignore what was going on around him. You could tell he was so uncomfortable having this group of giggling girls, and they're all dressed up in goofy costumes. I remember going over and just talking to him. I was like, wow, this is really, this guy, you know, this guy really has his stuff together. I made chocolate chip cookies, and Jim made a point of returning the tin to me. And he said, you know, they were the best chocolate chip cookies I ever had. And they say, you know, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. I guess that might have been true a little bit, so. We met the beginning of my junior year, the beginning of his senior year, and by the end of the year, you know, we just both knew that this is somebody we want to spend the rest of our lives with. You know, he was the epitome of duty on her country. That's something you want to be around. I mean, that's the kind of person you want to trust and build a life with. Someone that you can trust. His father was a general and he was stationed in the Pentagon. Lieutenant General James Houston Johnson. They were known sort of as Fort Bragg airborne royalty.
After graduation, Jim continues officers training, while Chris goes to ROTC Airborne School.
At that time, not a lot of women went through airborne school, and I was the only woman in my chalk. At the final graduation jump, he pinned my wings on, and the wings he gave me were the ones his father pinned onto him when he graduated from airborne school. You know, I just thought that that was really special. The day after that, it was a weekend, and I remember him saying, I'm gonna fix us a nice breakfast. The table was set for breakfast, and there was a bouquet of a dozen roses. And he got down on one knee and put the ring on me and asked me to marry him. So it was very romantic and very sweet. We got married on May 17th, 1987. I remember friends saying, I've never seen someone walk down the aisle so confident. Just felt so right.
When they come out of the church, they have the saber bearers who form an arch.
Two people in the front put the sabers down and cross and say, you know, you can only pass with a kiss. So of course the bride and groom have to kiss in front of everybody.
Right from the beginning, Chris understood that, you know, Jim would be in command, but Chris would be the commander's wife. Chris embraced that.
Chris puts her own military career on hold, and she and Jim raise 2 children, while moving from base to base.
I got involved in the community, learned the skill of being an Army wife and supported the career.
Army team couples is what we would call them. When they work well together, there's a halo effect.
We were a really awesome team, and they were building him to take on more advanced senior leadership roles.
Truly a great day to be here at Fort Benning, the home of the infantry.
Yeah, we had a happy marriage and happy family. We had a great life.
Jim's career is on the rise, at a time when the U.S. military needs more good leaders.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
He deployed to Afghanistan with the 82nd. They were a rapid deployment force. Jim got promoted to lieutenant colonel during that time. He came home the following year in 2003, was home for about 3 months, but he'd been selected to command a battalion. They were 101st Airborne Division in Iraq.
This will be a campaign unlike any other in history. A campaign characterized by shock, by surprise, and by the application of overwhelming force.
The children and I moved to Fort Campbell, Kentucky by ourselves because he had already left to go to Iraq. And in September 2005, he deployed again as a battalion commander. And I had concerns that he would be burnt out.
After being apart for almost 4 years, Jim finally returns home. It should be a happy reunion, but something's not right. He's cold and distant, even with his own children.
Jim changed during that deployment. Walking back from the soccer field for one of our children's games, he would just divert off and come back and show up 30 minutes later. Nothing I did was pleasing him. Nothing I did was good enough. All of a sudden, he's not initiating sex at all. So this is when the suspicion starts coming up. Something's not right. He's withdrawing from me. Intimacy is on a decline. What is up?
But then they receive the best possible news.
Jim was selected to command the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Italy, probably the most sought-after infantry brigade command in the United States Army.
We were very excited about it because we were all moving to Europe as a family.
In the summer of 2008, the family relocates to an idyllic residence in Vicenza.
We're finally all together in Europe, and it just didn't feel right. He started getting angry, and I started feeling like I was walking on eggshells around him. I'll never forget one day, too, during that time, he just looked at me and said, "Is this all there is?" Here, we'd worked so hard as a team to get to this, and it was hurtful.
By the end of the year, the relationship is even more strained.
Jim was always engaged with our family. We would do silly things like watch American Idol and all vote together, and he just didn't want to do those things. December 2008 was one of the most miserable Christmases I've ever had. Yeah. So many things weren't making sense. He was insistent that we were going to do a New Year's Eve party. I was worn out and thought, let's just enjoy the holidays as a family. We know you're going to deploy again next year. He said, oh, by the way, we're going to have this Iraqi family join us for this New Year's Eve weekend. And they were going to stay in the house with us.
Jim explains that he became acquainted with the Al-Attar family during his 2 tours in Iraq.
And that he said, there are interpreters. You understand that, right?
There's multiple interpreters at every level inside of a brigade operation. They are part of that same close-knit network for whom you would do almost anything.
I found out he's going to drive to the Netherlands and pick up this family 6 hours up, 6 hours back. And he doesn't have a vehicle big enough to fit them. So he's going to take a vehicle, a van, out of the motor pool, the brigade motor pool, a government-owned vehicle. and he's going to use it for personal reasons. That is a huge no-no. You don't do that. He would never be that kind of guy that would do that. He didn't lie, cheat, or steal. My gut kept saying something was off. And I couldn't put my finger on it.
Jim arrives home with his friends and presents Aladdin Alatar, his wife Shrek, and their 24-year-old daughter, Haveen.
I remember the father had a heavy mustache. The mother was kind of your frumpy housewife. And her daughter, she had long, dark hair, wore very dark makeup, and she had a young child.
For the first few moments, it seems like this could be a happy New Year's weekend after all. Until Jim does something subtle. Something only Chris, his wife of 20 years, would find shocking.
He scooped down and picked up the 14-month-old, and the child didn't flinch. Jim wasn't somebody that held other people's children, never scooped up a friend's child. It was woman's intuition. And right then and there, I realized that there's something about this family that's just not right. There was something going on here.
Chris is only about to discover the reason for her husband's distance.
In a very, very tiny community locked inside of Italy, there is a patent place of the highest order. There's no secrets.
Jim had gone against everything that the Army and West Point had taught him.
He's doing way worse. He's self-destructing. And little did I know, it was just the very beginning.
He destroyed his family, destroyed his name. He lost everything.
Colonel Jim Johnson is acting completely out of character at the family's New Year's dinner, especially with his interpreter's 24-year-old daughter, Haveen.
I remember not being able to eat. Everything about this is off. They had their own little private corner down on the end of the table. Haveen had a digital camera in her hands, and Jim was messing with it. And it was the same camera I had been given for Christmas. And he had given her one too, exact thing. I really didn't know how to process it. You're just ingesting it and trying to take the next breath. Keep your composure, don't fall apart in front of these people. That night, and I asked him if, he was having an affair with her. And he said, no, her family would kill her or disown her. Not, I don't feel that way about her. And then I asked him, well, have you kissed her? And he said, yes, but not passionately. What the hell does that mean?
That weekend, Jim tells Chris he wants to take the Alatars shopping at the Army PX.
One of my children said, oh, yeah, we had to wait for Haveen to make her grand entrance down the stairs because we were all sitting around just waiting for her. And she was upstairs doing I don't know what. Haveen is going to get shoes for the baby. And at one point, Jim's like, oh, I'm going to go over here. You take Haveen up to the register and pay for what she wants. So she's got these shoes. And on the way to the register, she finds a cute little sweater for herself. She picks out shampoo and other things for herself, just loading up on whatever product she's looking for. And I'm like floored. The mother, she would go outside and smoke cigarettes. During that whole weekend, she would go out and smoke a cigarette and leave the butt on the ground. Who does that? I ended up cleaning 12 cigarette butts off the ground when they left.
When Jim makes the overnight trip to take the Alatars back to the Netherlands, Chris is left alone to wonder how much trouble her relationship is in.
But I didn't want to believe that he was having sex with her. I still didn't want to believe it. I went into his office when I opened the top drawer, and I saw a notepad, and he had written 3 columns: divorce now, divorce in 6 months, divorce a year from now. And he had plotted out which would be most advantageous to him. I just remember when I found that note, feeling like the blood had drained from my face. That weekend I not only cooked, but I remember running a load of laundry for them. I did my husband's mistress's laundry. Jim got home and I said, I found a note in your desk today. And I said, are you divorcing me? And he looked at me shocked. He said, well, I'm sorry you saw that. No. And then he said, well, is that what you want? I said, no, I don't want a divorce. I want us to work things out.
When you have an affair in the military, if it's discovered, it normally doesn't turn out well for you in your career, which is why there's always denial, which is why you double down on denial.
Jim denies the affair, but Chris remains dubious.
I knew that the child, Haveen's daughter, could not have been Jim's. He had a vasectomy in June 2000. I think she was born in November 2007. It's not his child. I kept looking. And I don't know if I was still trying to look for something to prove myself wrong or just prove myself right. Well, I finally did. He has a black book, and in the back, he had all these secret email accounts. And that opened up, at that point, 3 years of emails that he had been communicating with Haveen. And some of them were so juvenile. Reading them were embarrassing. It was like he was a teenager, a horny teenager. Literally. One of the emails she wrote to him was I'm your little shaitan. It means devil in Arabic. That, you're a little shaitan, we make trouble all your life. Kissy, kissy. As the emails progressed between them, I started realizing certain things he was saying with her that corresponded with events in our life. Like him taking money out of one of our personal accounts. He had taken $10,000 and converted it to euro and gave it to her. My legs started shaking. I couldn't stop it. And I thought, screw this, I'm calling him. Woke him up and screamed in the phone, are you her? He can't deny he's having an affair. And of course he said, you're recording this call. Someone's listening in. He wouldn't answer the question. It then led to me insisting that we go to counseling to see the family life chaplain in Vicenza. Because I was not about to give up. I was not going to throw the towel in. I thought I'm going to fight for my marriage. Unfortunately, there's a fair amount of adultery in the Army. Chaplains are there to help preserve marriages. The chaplain gave us this book. And the book was about adultery. I don't even remember the name of the book. I hated it. It just made me so angry. One page said, the person having the affair, it's not your fault. And he just grasped onto that. Look, it's not all my fault. It's your fault too that I'm doing this. It allowed Jim to give himself permission to continue to blame me for his actions, which is insane.
If you're a psychologist, this is standard transference. It's transference of blame to somebody else so that you can feel good about yourself, and you build this case, and you actually begin to believe it.
Of course, now I look back and he lied even to this chaplain during our counseling. Not only did he not stop the affair, he continued it and got even more deeply involved. A credit card receipt from his work credit card came to our mail, and I opened it up and there was charges on there that didn't make sense. He was using his government credit card for her VoIP account so they could communicate. He did not stop at all. So then I'm starting to walk around with this big, deep, dark secret. Because if word got out that he was having an affair, his career's over. The Army doesn't tolerate adultery. And so I had this burden now. Now what do I do with this? I'd invested everything in him. Our family was invested. Our children had sacrificed for him to do what his country called him to do. I believed in it. Our children believed in it.
Chris has a very strong sense of right and wrong, very strong morals.
Jim was about to go down to combat with these guys again. I thought that the disruption of having your commander taken out, I did not want to cause a disruption in the brigade. I knew I had to dig up whatever strength I had to handle this with as much grace as I could and to protect Jim. Protect him from himself at this point.
Despite the betrayal, Chris continues to put Jim's needs first. And so does Jim.
Jim called early November, how soon can you be ready for a trip? I was like, well, where am I going? And he said, I've gotten a plane ticket for you and you're going to leave Italy. The only way I can fix our marriage is for you not to be there when I come home. I want you gone. I didn't know at that point what he was capable of.
He knows how to plan, he knows how to execute, he knows how to do war gaming, action, reaction, counter-reaction. Revenge becomes very, very powerful.
Noted, I'm Colonel Jim Johnson, commander of the 173rd Airborne Brigade Combat Team, stationed in...
Chris Johnson's husband is wielding his powers as an Army colonel to force her from their home in Vicenza, Italy.
In a normal press conference format.
He's kicking me out. Jim had also said on the phone call, I'm revoking your command sponsorship, which means I'm not allowed to stay in Europe as a family member. I'm gone. I can't stay.
It is very unique to see the brigade commander's wife return unless they choose to go home. Very, very odd.
I remember shaking. There was something in the tone of Jim's voice that scared me.
Jim is not only pushing Chris out, he's demanding she leave their children behind.
I didn't know at that point what he was capable of. He's the only Army brigade commander in all of Italy. No one questions you.
There was no way Chris would leave her children in a foreign country and come back to the States without them. No way.
I decided for my safety and my children's safety, we're just gonna leave. So I ran over to the school and withdrew the children. And then I got one-way plane tickets to leave Italy. I fled. I felt like I fled Italy. And I remember landing in JFK, meeting my parents, getting in the car. And I just remember looking out the window and thinking, now what? Now what do I do? I don't have a job. I have no money. I have nothing. Now what?
5 days later, Jim tracks Chris down at her parents' home.
Kept trying to call. He was calling my parents, and finally I just decided, okay, I'll answer the phone and tell him, stop harassing my mom and dad. I'm here. Our children are safe. My children were very angry with him because they knew about the affair. They met her. I mean, they spent a weekend with this woman that they knew their father was involved with.
Over the next 2 months, the battle over custody intensifies.
He had tried 2 emergency injunctions out of a court in Florida to get emergency custody, and were both denied. There was no cause for it.
In response, Jim initiates an obscure legal maneuver called the Hague Petition.
My understanding of the Hague Petition, he was claiming Chris had kidnapped the child and taken the child back to the United States against Jim's wishes, orders, permission.
Jim is desperate for custody.
He knows how to plan, he knows how to execute, he knows how to do war gaming, action, reaction, counter-reaction. Revenge becomes very, very powerful.
Chris is further stunned when she gets news from Vicenza.
By the end of December, I got a phone call from my neighbor, and she said, Chris, there's been a young woman with a child seen coming and going from your quarters in Vicenza. He had moved his mistress into our house with her kid.
Relationships with foreign nationals are always scrutinized. You're not allowed to have a foreign relationship without reporting that up through your security clearance. It is a security issue.
He just let her roll right in and sleep on my pillow and eat off my dishes. She was just gonna roll in and take the place of Chris Johnson. And it was at that point I realized no one's gonna stop him. He's blatant about the fact that he's having an affair.
Jim had gone against everything that the Army and West Point had taught him. beyond the point of no return.
That's when I realized, okay, I need to do something. And I thought, that's it. I've got to let the commanding general know. It was a moral decision for me to just sit back and not say anything. How do you look yourself in the mirror? I sat at my parents' computer. I typed like 5 pages, and I disclosed the email accounts that Jim had, the email accounts that Haveen had that I knew she used to communicate with him, the dates that I knew he had been with her, the misuse of government resources, the cell phone, the government credit card, like all the things I knew about.
After receiving Chris's letter, the Army immediately starts an administrative investigation, known as a 15-6.
By February, the 15-6 then rolled into a criminal investigation.
Meanwhile, the battle over the Hague petition escalates.
Jim's contention was that I was kicked off post because I was a disruption. He and his father both wrote affidavits saying that I was this disruption on the Army post, and that's why I was kicked off post, and that I was ordered to leave our children behind. But he was just trying to find anything to make my life hell. Jim called once and said, I'm going to send U.S. Marshals to the house, and you're going to get arrested. And that lasted for about 2 months. I mean, it was scary because who deals with a Hague? I'm being, accused of kidnapping our children and across international borders. And, it was 2 months of hell. It was amazing feeling when the judge ruled in my favor. My attorneys cried. I cried. I mean, they were so relieved. Stress will do terrible things to your body. I started getting sick, like a pain, abdominal pain, and found out ultimately that I had a pre-malignant tumor the size of a grapefruit on the tail of my pancreas. I had surgery December of 2011, and it was a much more complicated surgery than they had anticipated, and I ended up in the hospital for a week. I got a phone call from the hospital the day after I came home, and they said, well, we've just tried putting your claim into the military health insurance, and they've denied it. You're not covered. You owe us $100,000.
It was devastating. It's not like she had a lot of money.
As a military spouse, Chris should be fully covered.
I couldn't drive. I was still on meds. I was still, stitches and, still kind of a mess. And so my sister drove me to the ID card office on West Point. And I, sat down with a woman and handed her my ID card. And she pulled up the information on the computer and said, oh, well, you're divorced. I said, no, I'm not. She goes, yeah, on September 23rd, you got divorced. So they go and shred my ID card. And I just lose it. I just start crying. I'm not divorced. But they knew immediately something fishy was up.
West Point's ID card office notifies the Army's Criminal Investigation Division.
They had alerted Army CID. Because of all that, that's when the Army decided to do a preliminary look to investigate.
I get a phone call from Paul Danley, and he introduces himself as the lead CID agent investigating my husband. And he says, here's what we found out. Jim filed divorce registration. I'm going to scan a copy to you, and I want you to look at it. Your signature's on it. Can you tell me if you've ever seen it before?
That's when everything started to blow up, actually. And it appeared that the divorce decree, or whatever it was called, looked like it was just a copy of a marriage license from when he and Chris got married in New York, with some things changed.
Basically, he created his own certificate of divorce registration. But he forged my signature, made up a signature of clerk in Monroe, and signed his name.
He filed that with the military. Again, that's a crime.
He said, oh, and by the way, Jim and Haveen got married. On November 9th, they got married.
I couldn't believe that Colonel Johnson would do this, fake a divorce decree, and then marry Haveen while he's still married to Chris Johnson.
My husband had committed bigamy. bigamy. Every time I turned around, I thought, now what?
And then all of a sudden, we're getting calls from Vicenza saying, hey, you need to come here. They found a lot more information than what was in Chris Johnson's letter.
Colonel Jim Johnson, who was once committed to duty, honor, and country, has broken his oath in a startling way.
I mean, he committed bigamy. I remember just saying, I can't make this up. One of my children sent their dad an email later, and all it said was, how was the wedding? Was there cake?
It turns out that Jim has been on the radar of CID investigator Paul Danley for some time.
The whole thing started with a contract fraud investigation over in Afghanistan. The contracting office had alerted Army CID because there was a Colonel Johnson, that was raising a ruckus because his contractor wasn't getting paid. They were fairly low-level contracts. This is for cultural support services. They can understand why Colonel Johnson was berating them for not paying this contract when they had other, bigger issues going on. Water, feeding the troops, etc. And they said it was so bad that, it raised red flags. We thought the investigation was done, and out of the blue, Chris contacted me.
Chris provides the missing piece of the puzzle. The fact that the contractor in question is Jim's mistress's dad, Aladdin Alatar.
Why are you dating the contractor's daughter when you're paying her father? That's a big red flag.
So you got an Iraqi man advising on culture in Afghanistan. Apples, oranges, just didn't make sense.
Aladdin Alatar was actually living in The Hague in the Netherlands. He knew nothing about Afghanistan. So it raised just a lot of questions about why this contract was even signed.
Paul asks Chris to provide anything else she can. Emails, credit card statements, travel records.
They started putting the pieces together. So then when I said, by the way, he was also exchanging bank account information with Aladdin, they realized that there was way more to it. He was having an inappropriate relationship, among other things, fraud, misuse of government resources, the whole 9 yards.
Then we discovered that Colonel Johnson had given a phone to the Alatars, a government phone, I should say. And one of the bills came back, I think it was over $30,000 for a month, just for 1 month of cell phone usage.
But there's more. Investigators going through Jim's computer hard drive uncover questionable financial deals worth millions.
They'd found that Colonel Johnson had tried to have a almost $10 million contract let for windmills. The whole contract was spun up as being a way to get water to troops in remote posts, that they'd be able to produce their own water. So when I talked to the company rep for this windmill company, he explained that they wouldn't work in Afghanistan. Someone was trying to push through a contract, almost $10 million for these windmills that wouldn't work. Why are we doing this?
The money trail leads back to Jim and to Havin's father.
Aladdin Alatar had supposedly found these, or was working for this Dutch company that developed the windmills. If this contract had been signed, Aladdin would have got approximately $500,000 as a finder's fee. So that's a big flag. You get the same contractor, you're dating his daughter, and all of a sudden, he's gonna get $500,000.
Chris's information makes it possible for the Army to build a solid case on Jim's financial misdeeds. They also find blatant proof of Jim's adultery.
Jim and Havin made a sex tape, and he kept it on his government computer. They found it on his hard drive.
The greatest disgrace is where and when the tryst was recorded.
He was in Iraq and not in Afghanistan with his brigade. His brigade just went off to war. He's supposed to be leading his soldiers, and instead he's screwing around with his mistress. He's not a leader.
Army investigators have learned all they need to know about Jim Johnson. They're ready to prosecute. Jim is arraigned on a total of 27 charges, with a maximum possible sentence of 54 years.
The charges range from adultery, bigamy, fraud, misuse of government resources, and conduct unbecoming of an officer.
The Army flies Chris to Germany to attend a trial her email helped trigger, and which could cost Jim and her everything.
When you're married, as long as I was, to Jim, upon a divorce, you are eligible for up to half of the service member's military retirement. But if Jim's criminal behavior led to him being dismissed or incarcerated, those benefits would have been taken from him, and so then half of nothing would be nothing for me.
Jim's not going to be the only one that's going to be punished. Chris and the children are going to be punished as well.
Made my stomach churn.
Jim Johnson has not been shut down. Even in the midst of a court-martial, he's about to show his own family how destructive he can be.
Jim was going out of his way to do anything he could to cause Chris and their children pain.
It was just unbelievable. I was so hurt. I just blown away, numb.
I think it's horrible. I think that's the worst of it all.
On June 12, 2012, disgraced Army Colonel Jim Johnson gets his day in court, and Chris is there to watch over the proceedings every step of the way.
I remember at one time him looking at me, just, if he could kill me with his eyes, he would have, because I'm the one that blew the whistle.
The original list of 27 charges has come down to 2 counts of conduct unbecoming an officer and a gentleman by the time the trial starts.
He pled guilty to 15 charges. He had to plead guilty to adultery because they had a videotape of it.
I testified during the trial, testified for a couple days at least.
The prosecution presents an irrefutable case, thanks in part to the evidence Chris has provided them.
It seemed like the panel was getting close to, not only convicting him, but, giving him a sentence, involving some incarceration or maybe a dishonorable discharge from the military.
Jim's attorneys now put anyone willing to testify in defense of Jim on the stand, including Jim's father.
His father said, "My son is an honest man. My son's an honorable man. He's not a liar. My son's not a criminal." Dude, your son is a criminal. He just pled guilty to 15 charges, and now you're up on the witness stand saying, "My son's not a criminal." Really?
Both sides rest their case. It takes the jury only a few hours to reach their decision. Jim Johnson is convicted on 2 counts of conduct unbecoming of an officer. The Army pronounces his behavior to be of a nature to bring discredit upon the armed forces.
What happened to the guy that, embodied duty on our country? What happened to the man that, doesn't lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do?
Jim's sentencing hearing is one last chance to acknowledge the pain he's caused. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he uses the opportunity to plead with the court not to send him to jail, so he can care for his beloved Haveen.
He was talking about, allowing him to go back and save her and keep her from being deported. He also made a comment, he's like, "Haveen and her daughter are the center of my life." And one of my children behind me heard that and just started sobbing. Our children used to be the center of his life. His family, us, was the center of his life.
He destroyed the relationship with his children. He chose to do that. It's just, it's so sad.
5 years confinement or pay a $300,000 fine. That was his sentence. His father wrote a check for $300,000 and paid the fine. He could have gotten up to 54 years in prison. Instead, he walked out of the courtroom as a colonel with eagles still on his shoulders. justice wasn't served.
Jim should have gone to jail for what he did, but if he did go to jail, Chris and the children it would have been catastrophic for them.
Chris does finally divorce Jim Johnson, for real this time.
From what I understand, he's still with Haveen and her daughter. We have no communication. Our children are essentially estranged from him.
Chris and her kids get half of Jim's pension and benefits. She knows not everyone is as lucky.
There's no whistleblower protection for spouses. So you tolerate illegal and immoral behavior where you turn them in and you risk losing everything. And that's what led me into working on some legislation.
Chris amazes me. She fought for herself and she fought for her children, and now she's fighting for other families.
What we ultimately created was called the Family Served II Military Justice Reform Act. And what that would allow is if a service member commits misconduct, it allows the service to properly punish the lawbreaker without financial repercussions on the family. The benefits that the families also earn are protected. So that'll be my swan song from the Army. That'll be the last kind of move I do to help take care of families. I'm at peace where I'm at now, and I hope my story gives other spouses hope. You know, you can rebuild. You can have a happy, successful life after going through something so painful. You know, it's just nice to know that someone else who's dealt with it and has gotten through the tunnel towards the light and life is good again.
The first scream was never heard. It vanished into the frozen air of a Chicago winter night, swallowed by brick walls, locked windows, and the distant hum of traffic crawling along Lakeshore Drive. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, in a quiet apartment on the city's north side, a life was erased without witnesses, without noise, without mercy. By the time the sun rose, the silence had already hardened into mystery. And 30 years later, that silence would still echo, heavy, unresolved, haunting an entire city. February 3rd, 1995. Chicago was locked in ice. Snow crusted the sidewalks. Streetlights reflected off frozen puddles like pale halos. The city moved slower, wrapped in coats, breath fogging the air, unaware that in a modest second-floor apartment on West Addison Street, 24-year-old Emily Carter had just stepped into the final moments of her life. Emily was ordinary in every way that made her invisible. A graduate student at DePaul University, part-time barista, weekend volunteer at a local women's shelter. No enemies, no known conflicts, no record of danger. She was the kind of person whose absence would not be noticed immediately, whose routines were predictable, whose life unfolded in small, quiet gestures. Morning coffee, evening study sessions, phone calls to her mother every Sunday. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless, nothing that hinted at catastrophe. At 7:18 a.m., her neighbor, an elderly man named Frank Dolan, called 911 after noticing her apartment door standing slightly ajar. It was unusual. Emily was meticulous. Always locked. Always cautious. Officers arrived within minutes. They stepped into a scene that would etch itself into their memories for decades. Emily lay sprawled on the living room floor, her body twisted unnaturally, one arm stretched toward the door, fingers curled as if reaching for escape. Her eyes were open, her mouth frozen in a half-formed scream. A single blunt force wound to the back of her head had crushed the skull. No signs of forced entry. No overturned furniture. No defensive wounds. No blood trail. No murder weapon. It was as if death had slipped in, struck once, and vanished. The apartment was immaculate. No broken windows. No damaged locks. No sign of struggle. Her purse lay untouched on the kitchen table. Cash still inside. Jewelry still on her neck. Nothing stolen. Nothing disturbed. A killing without motive, without noise, without chaos. Within hours, the building swarmed with detectives, forensic technicians, patrol officers, and uniformed supervisors. Yellow tape fluttered in the wind. Neighbors whispered from behind curtains. Local news vans parked at the corner, their antennas slicing into the pale winter sky. Chicago police labeled it a homicide almost immediately. But beyond that single word, there were no answers. Who would kill Emily Carter?
And why?
The autopsy offered little clarity. Time of death estimated between midnight and 2 a.m. Cause: massive cranial trauma from a blunt object, possibly a hammer, possibly a heavy tool. One blow.
Clean.
Efficient. Fatal. There were no defensive injuries, suggesting she never saw it coming. No alcohol. No drugs. No evidence of sexual assault. It was execution without explanation. Detectives canvassed the building. Most tenants reported nothing unusual. No screams. No loud footsteps. No slamming doors. Just the dull winter silence and the distant sirens that never truly stopped in Chicago. One neighbor, a college student across the hall, recalled hearing faint footsteps around 1 a.m., slow, deliberate, heading toward the stairwell. Another thought she heard a door close softly. Nothing more. No faces. No descriptions. No clues. Emily's family arrived that afternoon. Her mother collapsed at the doorway, sobbing, unable to cross the threshold. Her father stood rigid, jaw clenched, staring at the chalk outline on the floor where his daughter had lain. Her younger brother kept repeating the same question over and over, as if sheer repetition might force the universe to answer. Who did this? The detectives had no reply. They built a timeline. Emily had worked her shift at the cafe until 8 p.m. She'd stopped by a grocery store. Security cameras showed her buying milk, bread, and apples. She walked home alone. No one followed. No suspicious figures appeared in the footage. She called her mother at 9:14 p.m., chatting about an upcoming midterm and plans to visit home the following weekend. Her tone was relaxed.
Calm.
Normal. That phone call became the last confirmed moment of her life. From there, everything dissolved into shadow. They interviewed classmates, professors, coworkers,
Friends.
ex-boyfriends. Nobody reported threats. Nobody described volatile conflicts. Nobody remembered strange behavior. Emily had no criminal ties. No secret relationships. No underground life. She was clean. Too clean. Detectives searched her apartment inch by inch. They dusted for fingerprints, swabbed surfaces, bagged fibers, collected shoe impressions near the doorway. The results were underwhelming. A few partial prints, all belonging to Emily or her known contacts. No unknown DNA. No foreign fibers. No clear shoe pattern. The killer had left nothing. Within days, the media latched onto the story. College student slain in silent apartment killing. Chicago cold case in the making? Mystery murder shocks North Side community. Vigils formed. Candles flickered beneath her photograph. Strangers left flowers, notes, prayers. Emily's face stared back from television screens across the city, frozen in youth, unaware of the legend she was becoming. But as the weeks stretched on, leads dried up. A man claiming to have seen a shadow near the building later admitted he'd been drinking. A supposed anonymous tip described a dark sedan idling nearby, but traffic cameras revealed nothing. A co-worker confessed to having a crush, then broke down in tears, cleared by alibi and evidence. Every trail collapsed. Every theory unraveled. And then, slowly, inevitably, the investigation began to cool. Detectives rotated off the case. New homicides demanded attention. The file grew thick but stagnant, collecting dust in metal cabinets deep inside police headquarters. Emily's name was whispered less often. Her photograph faded from news cycles. The city moved on. But her family did not. Her mother kept her bedroom untouched. Her father drove to Chicago twice a year, standing across the street from the apartment building, staring at the windows. Her brother pursued criminology, obsessed with understanding how someone could vanish into the cracks of the system. Years passed. Technology advanced. DNA databases expanded. Cold case units formed. Yet Emily's file remained silent. Until a single discovery, buried inside an unrelated investigation decades later, would reopen a wound Chicago believed had long since scarred over, exposing not just a killer, but a secret so deeply embedded within a family that its revelation would shatter everything they thought they knew. Because Emily Carter had not been killed by a stranger, and her death had not been random. It had been waiting. The first mistake investigators made was assuming the killer was a stranger. It was an understandable conclusion. There were no signs of forced entry, no theft, no visible struggle. The apartment door had been unlocked, not broken, which meant Emily had opened it. Voluntarily.
Trustingly.
She had let someone inside. That single fact should have narrowed the suspect pool to a handful of familiar faces. Instead, it expanded it into a fog of uncertainty. Because Emily trusted easily. She was known for her kindness, for her patience, for her habit of seeing good where others saw danger. Friends described her as gentle, empathetic, incapable of suspecting cruelty. If someone knocked on her door at 1 a.m, asking for help, Emily would have opened it. Without hesitation, without fear. And that made everyone a potential suspect. Detectives began with her immediate circle. Classmates, co-workers, neighbors, friends from church, old boyfriends, study partners, anyone who had ever shared a conversation, a coffee, a memory. Her phone records were pulled. Hundreds of calls. Most ordinary. A handful intriguing. One number appeared repeatedly in the weeks before her death, always late at night, often just minutes long. The line belonged to a payphone near a bus terminal 3 miles away. No camera. No records. No name. Just a series of unanswered questions. Investigators traced her movements. Every step. Every receipt. Every bus ride. Her life unfolded in careful timelines, but none led to danger. No suspicious detours. No shadowed meetings. No secret rendezvous. And yet, someone had entered her home. Someone she knew. Someone she trusted. The crime scene itself whispered clues that refused to speak clearly. The position of her body suggested surprise, not fear. No defensive wounds. No attempt to flee until after the blow had landed. It meant she recognized the person standing in front of her. She felt no immediate threat. Until it was too late. Forensic technicians scoured the apartment for anything out of place. One detail caught their attention. A glass of water on the kitchen counter, still half full. No fingerprints except Emily's. But it was positioned as if it had been set down hastily. As if someone had interrupted her mid-action. A knock at the door. A familiar face. A moment of conversation. Then a sudden turn. They found a faint smear of blood on the inside edge of the doorframe, nearly invisible unless caught by angled light. A microscopic trace, not enough for DNA extraction at the time, but enough to confirm that the attack happened right at the threshold. The killer had struck the moment Emily turned away. The murder weapon remained missing. No hammer, no pipe, no blunt object in the apartment or the surrounding dumpsters. It was as if the weapon had dissolved into the winter air. Detectives began reconstructing her social world, mapping connections like threads in a fragile web. They uncovered nothing sinister. No stalker. No harassment. No violent relationships. Her romantic life was minimal. One serious boyfriend during her undergraduate years, long since moved out of state, married, cleared by alibi. A few brief dates. Nothing more. But beneath the surface, subtle inconsistencies emerged. Friends recalled that Emily had seemed distracted in the weeks before her death. Tired. Preoccupied. Not distressed. Just distant. She canceled social plans. She stayed home more often. She avoided certain topics. When asked if something was wrong, she brushed it off. Just school stress, she said. But her journals told a different story. Inside a spiral notebook hidden beneath her mattress, detectives found fragmented entries, disconnected thoughts, half-finished sentences, cryptic remarks that hinted at unease. I think I'm finally starting to understand. There are things I was never supposed to know. He keeps calling. I can't tell, Mom. Not yet. The handwriting grew tighter, more frantic, less fluid. Who was he? What was she beginning to understand? And why couldn't she tell her mother? Investigators returned to her family, probing gently, cautiously. Emily's parents were cooperative, devastated, transparent. They had no idea who might be calling her late at night. They knew nothing of secrets, nothing of threats, nothing of danger. Her brother, Michael, was more reserved. He hesitated when asked about Emily's behavior in recent months. Then he admitted something that sent a faint ripple through the room. She'd been asking questions, he said. What kind of questions? A detective pressed. About her childhood, about things that didn't make sense. Old arguments, old absences. What absences? Michael swallowed. My dad used to disappear for weeks sometimes.
Business trips, he said.
But Emily started wondering if there was more to it. Detectives noted the detail, filed it away. At the time, it seemed unremarkable. Families had secrets. Marriages fractured. Parents traveled. Nothing that explained murder. Still, the idea lingered. As weeks turned into months, the investigation widened. They chased rumors. A janitor with a criminal record. A former tenant with violent tendencies. A transient spotted near the building. Each lead collapsed under scrutiny. Every suspect dissolved into nothing. The case grew cold.
And cold cases do not die.
They wait. Years passed. The city changed. Neighborhoods transformed. Buildings renovated. The apartment on West Addison was repainted, remodeled, rented to new tenants who slept in the same room where Emily had died, unaware of the history beneath their feet. Inside police headquarters, her file migrated from active shelves to cold case archives, where thousands of unsolved deaths whispered in silent rows. But occasionally, a detective would pull it out, flip through the pages, stare at the photographs, and feel the unease settle in their bones. Because this case did not behave like random violence. There was precision, restraint, purpose, and, above all, patience. In 2003, a new forensic review re-examined the blood smear. Technology had advanced. DNA extraction was now possible from smaller samples. The results came back inconclusive. Too degraded. Too fragmented. Another door closed. In 2009, detectives cross-referenced Emily's case against a growing database of violent offenders. No matches. No overlaps. No patterns. Another dead end. By 2015, the case had officially become a cold case, relegated to a specialized unit handling decades-old crimes with dwindling hope and limited resources. And then, in 2024, everything changed. Not because someone confessed. Not because a witness came forward. But because a man arrested for an unrelated offense made a single, careless remark that triggered a cascade of revelations no one had anticipated. A man whose name appeared nowhere in Emily's file. A man whose existence the Carter family had barely acknowledged. A man whose blood ran closer to Emily's than anyone could have imagined. And with that single remark, a 30-year lie began to unravel. The man sat alone in a gray interrogation room, wrists cuffed to a metal ring bolted into the table, fluorescent lights humming overhead like a swarm of trapped insects. His name was Daniel Mercer, 49 years old, recently arrested for assault during a bar fight that had spiraled violently out of control. A routine arrest. A routine background check. Nothing about the case suggested it would disturb the dead. Until Daniel began to talk. At first, it was casual, defensive. He complained about police harassment, about bad luck, about how life had always dealt him the wrong hand. His criminal history was thin but troubling: minor assaults, disorderly conduct, alcohol-fueled altercations. The portrait of a man simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for an excuse to erupt. Then, halfway through the interview, he muttered a sentence that snapped every head in the room upright. "People always think the past stays buried," he said, staring at the table. "But it never does. Not when blood's involved." The detectives exchanged glances. What do you mean by that? One asked. Daniel exhaled slowly. Nothing. Just old memories. They pressed. He resisted. Then, as if surrendering to exhaustion, he added, almost absent-mindedly, some things from Chicago never let go. That was enough. His record showed he had lived in Chicago briefly in the mid-1990s before disappearing into a drifting, unstable life across several states. No fixed address. No long-term employment. No family ties listed. Except one. Emily's mother. The room fell silent. Investigators pulled the archived files. Compared addresses. Cross-referenced timelines. The connection was real. Daniel Mercer had once been romantically involved with Laura Carter, a relationship that existed quietly, briefly, and almost completely erased from public memory. A relationship that ended abruptly in 1994, 1 year before Emily's murder. Detectives began digging. Laura Carter had married her husband, Thomas Carter, in 1970. A stable union, 2 children, a modest life. By all outward appearances, unremarkable. But records revealed a separation in 1993. Brief, official, unexplained. They reconciled months later. During that separation, Laura had met Daniel Mercer. Friends recalled it vaguely. A troubled man. Charismatic. Intense. Unpredictable. He drank heavily. He argued violently. The relationship burned hot and collapsed fast. Laura cut ties. Returned to her husband. Buried the episode deep. But secrets, when buried, ferment. Detectives re-interviewed Laura, now in her 70s. Age had thinned her voice. Grief had carved permanent lines into her face. When they mentioned Daniel's name, something flickered in her eyes. Fear. Recognition. Regret. I haven't heard that name in 30 years, she whispered. They asked about the affair. She hesitated, then nodded. It was a mistake, she said. A terrible mistake. I ended it. I told him never to contact me again. Did he obey? A detective asked. She shook her head slowly. He called. He wrote letters. I ignored them. Eventually it stopped. Did Emily know about him? Laura froze. I don't think so, she said. But the answer lacked conviction. Investigators pressed gently. They described Emily's journal entries, the late-night phone calls, the cryptic references. Laura's breathing grew shallow. She asked questions, Laura admitted, about that year, about why her father and I almost divorced. I told her it was just stress, just money, nothing more. But she didn't believe you. Laura lowered her gaze. No. The realization struck like a blow. Emily had discovered the affair. And someone else had discovered Emily knew. Detectives turned back to Daniel Mercer. Confronted with the connection, he laughed. Not mockingly. Bitterly. She figured it out, didn't she? He said. Figured what out? They demanded. That she wasn't supposed to exist, he muttered. The words detonated inside the room. They pushed him harder. He resisted. Then cracked. In fragmented, halting confessions, Daniel revealed a truth that reconfigured everything. Emily Carter might not have been Thomas Carter's biological daughter. In 1994, during the affair, Laura had become pregnant. Emily was already 23 at the time, a college student, a woman grown. But Daniel believed, insisted, that Laura had hidden the affair for decades and that the pregnancy had not ended. The timeline seemed impossible, until hospital records surfaced. In late 1970, just months after Laura's wedding, she had given birth prematurely. Complications. Sparse documentation. A medical transfer between facilities. An adoption record sealed by court order. A child listed as stillborn. But no death certificate. Emily's birth certificate, issued years later, had anomalies. Altered dates. Irregular signatures. Inconsistent hospital identifiers. A paper trail frayed at the edges. DNA testing would eventually confirm the unthinkable. Emily was Daniel Mercer's biological daughter. The room went silent. The implications rippled outward, violent and disorienting. If Daniel was her father, Then the affair hadn't occurred in 1994. It had happened decades earlier, before Laura's marriage. Daniel had re-entered her life in the 1990s, reigniting old connections, old resentments, old secrets. Emily, driven by curiosity, by instinct, by a sense that something in her family history did not align, had begun searching. And she had found him. Phone records confirmed it. The late-night calls traced back to payphones Daniel frequented. Emily had contacted him,
Confronted him.
asked questions no one wanted answered.
Who am I?
Why did you leave? Why did my mother lie? And in those conversations, the fragile structure of Daniel's self-control collapsed. He had never built a stable life. He drifted. He drank. He fought. He resented. And now, the child he never knew, the secret he never buried, had surfaced, threatening to expose everything. According to Daniel, Emily wanted the truth. She wanted proof. She wanted answers. She wanted to tell her family. She said she wouldn't stay quiet, he muttered. She said she deserved to know. And you? A detective asked. I panicked, he whispered. The night of February 3rd, 1995, Daniel traveled across the city. He knocked on Emily's door. She let him in. They argued. Voices low.
Tension thick.
Accusations. Denials. Then fear. Daniel claimed he never intended to kill her. That the blow was impulsive. Reflexive. A moment of rage detonated by terror. He said he didn't remember lifting the object. Only the sound. The crack. The sudden stillness. When he fled, the weapon was gone. Tossed into the Chicago River. Buried beneath ice and black water. 30 years of silence followed. Until now. But confessions alone were not enough. Detectives needed proof. Physical. Biological. Irrefutable. They exhumed evidence. They extracted DNA. They compared bloodlines. The results detonated across police headquarters. Daniel Mercer was Emily Carter's biological father. And her killer. The revelation tore through the Carter family like shrapnel. Laura collapsed upon hearing the truth. Thomas retreated into silence. Michael, her brother, spiraled into fury and disbelief, his entire identity destabilized by a history rewritten overnight. Chicago reeled. A cold case, frozen for 3 decades, thawed in a single week, revealing not just murder, but a lineage of deception, secrecy, and unintended cruelty. But even as the legal machinery began grinding toward justice, one question remained, echoing louder than the rest. How could a mother carry such a secret for a lifetime? And what does it do to a family when the truth finally claws its way into the light? The truth did not arrive gently. It crashed through the Carter family like a freight train, flattening everything in its path. 30 years of carefully constructed memory collapsed in a matter of hours, leaving behind only wreckage, silence, and questions no one was prepared to answer. Laura Carter did not scream when detectives told her. She did not cry. She did not collapse. She simply stared, unmoving, as if her mind had sealed itself off from reality. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I killed her, she whispered. Not with my hands, but with my lies. Those words would follow her for the rest of her life. For Thomas Carter, the man who had raised Emily as his own, the revelation was a slow, suffocating unraveling. He had built his identity on loyalty, stability, sacrifice. He worked overtime, missed birthdays, skipped vacations, all for a daughter who, genetically, was not his. But genetics had never mattered to him. Emily was his child. He had rocked her to sleep, walked her to school, held her hand through fevers and heartbreaks. That truth did not change. What changed was everything else. The foundation of his marriage. The story of his family. The narrative he had lived inside for half a century. Now it was a lie. Michael, Emily's younger brother, took the truth like a physical blow. Rage pulsed through him. Rage at his mother. Rage at Daniel. Rage at the system. Rage at himself for never seeing it. His entire childhood reframed overnight. Every memory poisoned by uncertainty. He stopped speaking to Laura. He refused interviews. He disappeared into isolation, haunted by the thought that the man who murdered his sister shared her blood. The media did not wait. Within hours of Daniel Mercer's arrest, headlines detonated across the nation. Chicago cold case solved after 30 years. Killer was victim's biological father. Family's secret unravels decades-old murder mystery. Truth buried for a generation finally exposed. News vans lined West Addison Street once more. Microphones pushed toward grieving relatives. Neighbors relived a nightmare they thought long buried. The apartment building became a spectacle, its brick facade transformed into a monument of horror. Public reactions swung violently between shock and revulsion. Some condemned Laura, accusing her of deception, complicity, betrayal. Others defended her, pointing to the suffocating social climate of the 1970s, the stigma of unwed pregnancy, the fear that drives desperate choices. But empathy fractured when details of Daniel's confessions emerged. He had threatened Emily, warned her to stay silent, begged her to forget. And when she refused, he killed her. This was not a crime of passion. It was a crime of preservation. Daniel Mercer was charged with first-degree murder. No bail, no leniency, no mercy. In court, he appeared diminished,
Smaller.
grayer. The violence that once coiled beneath his skin reduced to hollow eyes and trembling hands. He pleaded not guilty by reason of emotional disturbance. His defense argued decades of untreated trauma, alcoholism, abandonment. The prosecution dismantled that narrative piece by piece. They painted him as a man driven by entitlement, secrecy, and control. A man who believed he had the right to erase the consequences of his own actions. A man who chose murder over exposure. The trial became a spectacle. Every revelation reopened wounds. Hospital records. Adoption documents. Letters Daniel had written and Laura had destroyed. Phone logs. Journal entries. DNA results. Emily's voice, long silent, echoed through court transcripts, journal fragments, and recorded interviews with friends. Her search for identity, her quiet unraveling, her fear. She had been standing at the edge of a truth too large to survive. Witnesses testified to Daniel's volatility. Former lovers described explosive rage. Co-workers recounted sudden outbursts. Neighbors recalled violent arguments. A portrait of a man perpetually on the brink. But the most devastating testimony came from Laura. On the stand, she spoke of fear, of shame, of societal pressure, of choosing silence to protect a fragile life. She described the affair in trembling detail. The pregnancy, the impossible choice, the years of concealment, the reunion, the terror when Daniel resurfaced. And finally, the night Emily told her she had found him. She said she was going to meet him, Laura whispered. I begged her not to. I told her nothing good would come of it. Did you warn her? The prosecutor asked. I tried, she said. But I never told her the whole truth. I was afraid. Afraid. That word echoed through the courtroom like an accusation. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours. Guilty. Daniel Mercer was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The gavel fell. Justice delayed but finally delivered. And yet, closure refused to arrive. Because solving the case did not heal the wounds it exposed. The Carter family fractured beyond repair. Laura retreated into solitude, haunted by remorse. Thomas divorced her within the year, unable to reconcile love with betrayal. Michael relocated, severing nearly all ties to Chicago, seeking anonymity, escape, a life not defined by tragedy. Emily's grave became a pilgrimage site. Flowers, letters, candles, notes from strangers promising remembrance. But remembrance carried weight. Every anniversary reopened scars. Every headline reignited pain. Every retelling carved deeper grooves into collective memory. Chicago absorbed the story into its mythology of crime and loss. A cautionary tale, a nightmare of secrets, a testament to the long reach of truth. And somewhere, deep within the cold, echoing corridors of a maximum security prison, Daniel Mercer sat alone, confronted by the wreckage of a life defined by denial. He had erased his daughter, but he had not erased the truth. It had waited, and it had won. The verdict closed the courtroom doors, but it did not close the story. It did not silence the echoes that lingered in every hallway, every living room, every quiet corner where memory still breathed. Justice had spoken, yet something essential remained unresolved, suspended in the thin space between truth and peace, where grief refuses to settle. Chicago tried to move on. But the city had learned something uncomfortable. Some wounds do not heal. They only deepen, hardening into scars that stretch across generations. In the weeks following the sentencing, reporters searched for neat conclusions. They wanted redemption, closure, forgiveness. They found none. The Carter family had scattered like ash in the wind. No interviews. No statements. No public reconciliation. Only absence. Laura Carter vanished from public life. She sold the family home, gave away most of Emily's belongings, packed what remained into sealed boxes she never opened again. Friends said she rarely left her apartment, that she spoke to no one, that her voice had grown thin, brittle, as if each word scraped against unbearable weight. She replayed the past endlessly, combing through decades of memory, searching for the precise moment when everything became inevitable. The first lie, the second, the choice to stay silent, the decision to protect herself instead of her child. And in that spiral of regret, one question returned with relentless cruelty. If she had told Emily the truth sooner, would she still be alive? Thomas Carter moved into a small house near Lake Michigan alone. He kept Emily's photograph beside his bed. Sometimes he would wake in the middle of the night convinced he heard her footsteps in the hallway, the faint creak of the floorboards announcing her return. The illusion would dissolve, leaving only silence. For him, the pain was not betrayal. It was loss, layered upon loss. He had not merely lost a daughter. He had lost the narrative of his own life. Every memory now carried a fracture, a subtle distortion that could never be ignored. Michael Carter abandoned Chicago entirely. He cut ties with extended family, changed phone numbers, deleted social media. The world he had known felt contaminated by revelation. Everywhere he looked, he saw the outlines of secrets. He carried Emily with him like a shadow. And then there was the apartment. The building on West Addison remained occupied, renovated, repainted, sanitized of visible horror. Yet tenants reported a persistent unease, a heaviness, a sensation of being watched. Some claimed to hear footsteps late at night, slow and deliberate, pacing across the living room floor. Management dismissed the stories as imagination, grief echoing through suggestion. But the whispers continued. Cold cases, once solved, often lose their mystique. This one did not. It grew. The psychological dimensions fascinated criminologists. How identity, secrecy, and fear could intertwine to produce such catastrophic violence. How a family system could incubate tragedy without visible signs. How silence, stretched across decades, could become lethal. Emily's journals were archived, studied, dissected. Scholars analyzed her language patterns, her emotional shifts, her mounting anxiety. They identified the gradual awakening of suspicion, the slow realization that something fundamental about her origin did not align. She had sensed the truth long before she uncovered it. And in that intuition lay her doom. The public wrestled with complex sympathy. Was Laura a villain? A victim? Both. Was Daniel a monster? Or a broken man who had never learned restraint? Did biology excuse brutality? Did fear justify murder? The questions multiplied, but answers remained elusive. Because this was not a story about evil. It was a story about weakness, about avoidance, about the human instinct to hide from consequences. Daniel Mercer did not wake up one morning intent on killing his daughter. He woke up terrified of exposure, terrified of losing the fragile illusions that sustained him, terrified of facing what he had abandoned decades earlier. And fear, when cornered, can become lethal. In prison, Daniel withdrew from the world. He refused interviews, rejected counseling, declined appeals. Guards reported long hours of motionless silence, staring at blank walls. He wrote no letters, made no calls, ate mechanically, slept fitfully. Once, during a routine medical check, a nurse asked him if he regretted what he had done. He closed his eyes. "I regret that she knew," he said. "Not that he killed her. That she knew." Those words would circulate through news outlets like poison, because they revealed everything. He did not see Emily as a daughter. He saw her as a threat. And in that perception, her humanity vanished. Meanwhile, Emily's legacy took on a strange new life. Scholarships were established in her name. Support groups formed for adoptees and families navigating hidden histories. Her story became a cautionary tale taught in criminal psychology courses, a case study in the destructive power of concealed identity. But none of that softened the reality that she had died alone, betrayed by blood, silenced by fear. 30 years of mystery had given way to clarity. But clarity did not bring peace. Instead, it exposed the fragile architecture of trust, revealing how easily it can collapse when secrets accumulate, when truth is deferred, when silence becomes policy. And in that exposure, a darker realization surfaced. Emily's case was not unique. It was merely visible. Across the country, thousands of families harbored buried histories, affairs, adoptions, abandonments, paternity doubts, untold narratives sealed behind polite smiles and holiday traditions. Most would remain harmless. Some would not. And that possibility lingered like a low, electric hum beneath the surface of collective consciousness. Because if one family's silence could culminate in murder, then how many others teetered unknowingly at similar thresholds? Chicago tried to forget. But every winter, when snow settled across West Addison Street, when the cold thickened the air and muffled the city's pulse, residents remembered. They remembered the night a young woman opened her door to a familiar face. They remembered the single, fatal blow. They remembered 30 years of unanswered questions. And they remembered the moment the truth finally broke through, sharp and unforgiving, dismantling everything in its path. Some stories end. This one simply echoes. In the aftermath, investigators began asking the question no one had dared to voice during the trial. Not who did it, not why,
But how?
how had a crime so personal, so intimate, remained invisible for 3 decades? How had the truth brushed past police hands, time and again, without ever being grasped? The answer lay buried inside the earliest days of the investigation, when assumptions hardened into conclusions, and conclusions became blinders. In 1995, Chicago was drowning in violence. Murders arrived in clusters, not singular shocks. Detectives juggled dozens of cases at once, moving from one crime scene to the next, following trails that evaporated as quickly as they formed. In that chaos, Emily's murder, quiet and contained, seemed an anomaly. No forced entry, no theft, no witnesses, no obvious motive. They classified it as a likely acquaintance killing. But they searched in the wrong direction. They hunted outward, not inward. Their focus settled on boyfriends, classmates, coworkers, neighbors. The immediate social sphere. They never considered the family circle as a source of danger. Laura and Thomas were cooperative, grieving, devastated. Their pain appeared genuine, their sorrow disarming. No one imagined that the answers lay hidden beneath decades of silence. And yet, the clues had been there. The late-night calls from payphones, the journal entries, the subtle shift in Emily's behavior, the timeline inconsistencies surrounding her birth. Each fragment, isolated, meant nothing. Together, they formed a map. But maps require perspective. In the 1990s, forensic genealogy did not exist. DNA databases were skeletal. Interagency communication was limited. Adoption records were fiercely protected. Family secrets remained legally fortified behind layers of bureaucracy. The truth had been structurally invisible. Even if a detective had suspected hidden paternity, there was no efficient mechanism to prove it. So the case drifted. Cold cases are not merely unsolved crimes. They are artifacts of their era, frozen within the technological and cultural limitations of their time. What cannot be known then becomes obvious later. But hindsight does not resurrect the dead. One detective, retired long before Daniel's arrest, watched the press conference from his living room, hands trembling. "I interviewed her mother 3 times," he said later. "I looked into her eyes and believed everything she told me. I still do. I think she believed it too. I think she convinced herself. Because lies repeated long enough become memories. And memories, repeated long enough, become truth." Laura Carter had lived inside her own fabrication for so many years that it reshaped her reality. She no longer remembered the exact contours of deception, only its emotional residue.
Fear, guilt, dread.
A constant low-level anxiety that something, someday, would break through. That anxiety had transferred to Emily. Children absorb unspoken tension. They sense the pauses, the evasions, the topics never discussed. They grow attuned to the gaps in narrative. Emily had grown up inside a story that felt incomplete. And eventually, she began searching for its missing chapters. When she found Daniel, she stepped into a space her mother had spent a lifetime avoiding. And she paid for it with her life. In retrospect, psychologists recognize the tragic convergence of 2 opposing forces. Emily's need for truth, Daniel's need for concealment. Where those forces met, violence erupted. Investigators reconstructed their final meeting from phone records, transit logs, and Daniel's confession. Emily had invited him over. She wanted answers in person.
Proof. Clarity.
Perhaps reconciliation. Daniel arrived carrying decades of resentment, insecurity, and fear. The argument escalated. Voices rose. Threats surfaced. In a moment of blind panic, he grabbed the nearest object. One strike. One irreversible choice. Everything ended. And yet, one unsettling possibility lingered. What if the system had intervened sooner? If adoption records were accessible? If DNA testing was routine? If psychological support had existed for families navigating hidden histories? If Laura had felt safe telling the truth? If Daniel had sought help? If Emily had not been alone? What if? The questions spiraled endlessly, each branching into infinite alternatives, none of them capable of rewriting the past. But they mattered, because Emily's case became a catalyst for reform. Illinois legislators revisited adoption disclosure laws, easing access for adults seeking biological origins. Cold case units received increased funding. Forensic genealogy protocols expanded. Victim advocacy groups grew louder, demanding transparency and psychological support for families entangled in secrecy. From tragedy, cautious progress emerged. But progress did not absolve the pain. It simply reshaped it. For every family who learned the truth peacefully, another learned it violently. And Emily's story hovered over those revelations like a warning. Be careful what you bury. It will not stay buried. In Chicago, new generations walked past the building on West Addison unaware of the history embedded in its walls. They laughed. They argued. They loved. They lived. Life pressed forward, relentless, indifferent. Yet somewhere, in the city's collective subconscious, the memory lingered. The image of a young woman frozen in time. The echo of a door opening. The hush before impact. And the knowledge that the greatest threats do not always come from strangers in the dark, but from familiar faces carrying secrets too heavy to bear. There is a particular kind of fear that does not scream. It does not tremble. It does not run. It waits. It settles deep inside the chest, slow and patient, shaping every decision, bending every memory, until the person carrying it can no longer distinguish survival from destruction. That was the fear that ruled Daniel Mercer's life. Long before the night he stood outside Emily Carter's door, Daniel had learned to exist in fragments. Childhood marked by instability. A father who vanished. A mother who numbed herself with alcohol. homes that changed as often as schools. Each relocation eroded attachment, replacing it with suspicion. Trust became dangerous. Connection became temporary. By adolescence, Daniel had learned to strike first, emotionally or physically, to avoid being abandoned.
He drank. He fought.
He left before he could be left. Every relationship followed the same trajectory: intensity, volatility, collapse. When he met Laura in the early 1970s, he glimpsed something unfamiliar: stability, structure, a life that seemed coherent. He wanted to belong to it,
but he did not know how.
Their affair was brief, secretive, fueled by longing and insecurity. When Laura became pregnant, Daniel panicked. Fatherhood threatened to anchor him to responsibilities he had never learned to carry. When she disappeared from his life, he convinced himself it was for the best. But suppression is not erasure. Decades later, when Laura resurfaced during her marital separation, the old wounds reopened. Daniel mistook nostalgia for redemption. He imagined reclaiming a lost narrative. But Laura, anchored in family, retreated once more. And again, Daniel was left alone with ghosts. Then Emily called. A voice he had never known.
A daughter.
A mirror of himself. Suddenly, the past was not abstract. It was alive, curious, insistent. Emily's questions dismantled the fragile structures Daniel had built to survive. Each call stripped away another layer of denial. Each meeting cornered him deeper inside truths he had avoided for a lifetime. And in those conversations, a terrifying possibility crystallized. Exposure. If Emily spoke, everything would collapse. His anonymity, his narrative, his control. The fear that had once driven him to flee now drove him to destroy. Psychologists later dissected his mindset, identifying patterns of catastrophic thinking. For Daniel, consequences were not incremental. They were absolute. Exposure meant annihilation, loss of identity, public disgrace, total rejection. In his mind, the threat was existential. And existential threats, in fractured minds, justify extreme response. Meanwhile, Emily walked toward truth with a courage she did not fully recognize. She sought identity not out of rebellion, but out of coherence. She wanted her story to make sense. She wanted to understand the unease she had carried since childhood, the sense that something fundamental was missing. She approached Daniel not as an adversary, but as a missing piece. But missing pieces, when forced into place, can shatter the entire puzzle. The night of February 3rd unfolded with cruel inevitability. Emily opened the door. She invited him inside. They stood in her small living room, surrounded by ordinary objects: textbooks, coffee mugs, potted plants. The quiet architecture of a life still in progress. Their conversation began cautiously, then sharpened, then erupted. Words collided. Accusations surged. Emily demanded honesty. Daniel demanded silence. And when silence failed, violence followed. After the blow, the room transformed. The ordinary became grotesque. The familiar turned lethal. In seconds, Emily's future evaporated. Daniel fled, carrying nothing but the weight of irreversible choice. For 30 years, that weight pressed against him, shaping his isolation, his alcoholism, his volatility. It surfaced in bar fights, in reckless behavior, in restless drifting. His life became a prolonged echo of that single moment. He had killed to preserve a lie. But lies rot.
And rot spreads.
Emily's story forced the public to confront uncomfortable realities about family, identity, and the destructive potential of secrecy. It shattered comforting myths about the safety of domestic space. It challenged the assumption that danger always arrives from outside. Sometimes it grows within. The case provoked intense debate in academic circles. Was Daniel solely responsible? Or did systemic pressures, stigma, rigid morality, inaccessible records contribute to the catastrophe? The answer was not binary. Tragedy rarely emerges from a single source. It forms where multiple failures intersect. a culture that punished unwed pregnancy, a legal system that sealed records, a family dynamic that prioritized appearance over authenticity, a man incapable of confronting his own past, a young woman brave enough to seek truth. Each element converged, and at that intersection, life ended. Yet, amid the devastation, Emily's voice endured. Her journals, now archived, revealed not despair, but resilience,
Curiosity.
determination, compassion. Even as she sensed danger, she sought understanding, not confrontation. "I just want to know who I am," she had written. In that simple sentence lay the essence of human longing.
To belong.
To understand. To exist within a coherent narrative. Emily died pursuing that basic need. And in doing so, she exposed the catastrophic cost of denying it. The city absorbed her story into its collective consciousness, a caution whispered beneath the noise of everyday life. Be honest.
Be brave.
Because silence, when prolonged, becomes lethal. In the months after the verdict, something subtle began to shift. Not in courtrooms, not in newsrooms, but in living rooms, kitchens, bedrooms, and hospital corridors, where families sat across from one another in uneasy silence, carrying secrets that suddenly felt heavier than ever before. Emily Carter's story traveled far beyond Chicago. It moved through online forums, late-night radio shows, podcasts, documentaries, and academic conferences. Each retelling sharpened its edges, stripping it of locality until it became universal. A story not about one woman, but about truth delayed, and the cost of that delay. Across the country, adoption agencies reported surges in inquiries. Adults who had long suspected hidden origins began searching for biological roots. Parents who had kept painful histories locked away found themselves confronted by an uncomfortable realization. Silence was no longer protection. It was risk. Therapists noticed patterns. Clients referencing Emily's case as a turning point. A moment that forced long-avoided conversations. Confessions whispered through tears. Letters written and destroyed and rewritten. Families renegotiating narratives they had lived inside for decades. Because Emily's death had revealed a dangerous equation. When truth is suppressed, it does not disappear. It mutates. And mutation breeds instability. In Chicago, the apartment building on West Addison became a quiet pilgrimage site. Visitors left notes, poems, photographs of daughters, of sisters, of sons, of mothers, messages scrawled in hurried ink. "Thank you for reminding me to tell my daughter the truth. I finally found my biological father. I'm sorry we waited too long." Grief intertwined with gratitude. Pain braided with resolve. Emily's absence became a catalyst for countless presences. Yet for those closest to her, the weight only deepened. Michael Carter, living anonymously in another state, followed the story from a distance. He read the articles, watched the documentaries, listened to strangers dissect his sister's life, his family's secrets, his mother's choices. Some nights, he dreamed of Emily standing at the edge of a crowded room, trying to speak while her voice dissolved into noise. He never heard what she said. And when he woke, the silence was unbearable. Laura Carter did not watch the coverage. She avoided mirrors, avoided memories, avoided reflection. But the world refused to let her forget. Letters arrived, some compassionate, others venomous. She did not open most of them. She stacked them in a drawer that eventually overflowed. She lived now in a small apartment, sparse, almost sterile. No photographs, no mementos, no visible history, only the faint scent of disinfectant and the hum of an old refrigerator. The erasure mirrored her inner state. She had spent a lifetime erasing. Now, she erased herself. And yet, even in isolation, the truth followed her. In the quiet hours before dawn, she replayed the moment Emily had first questioned her. The softness of her daughter's voice. The uncertainty in her eyes. "Mom," she had asked, "is there something you never told me?" Laura had smiled, brushed her hair back, changed the subject. That deflection echoed louder than any scream. Elsewhere, Daniel Mercer settled into the monotony of incarceration. Days blurred, weeks dissolved, seasons passed unnoticed. He aged rapidly. His body weakened, his eyes dulled, but his mind remained restless, trapped in a cycle of rumination. Guards observed him murmuring in his sleep. Sometimes he whispered her name. Sometimes he whispered apologies. Sometimes he whispered nothing at all. Once, during a mandatory counseling session, he admitted something he had never said aloud. "I wanted her to forgive me," he said, before she told anyone. "I wanted absolution." The counselor waited. "And when I realized she wouldn't give it," Daniel continued, "I took everything." That confession illuminated the core of the tragedy. Not hatred, not cruelty, but entitlement. The belief that one person's need for redemption outweighed another's right to exist. The belief that forgiveness could be demanded, that truth could be negotiated, that consequences could be avoided. These illusions, once shattered, left only devastation. Emily's story exposed how fragile the boundary between love and violence can become when filtered through fear. She had not threatened Daniel with police. She had not sought revenge. She had not demanded public exposure. She had simply sought truth. But for Daniel, truth was annihilation. So he annihilated its source. The implications rippled outward, forcing society to confront uncomfortable questions about identity, secrecy, and the structures that incentivize concealment. How many people lived inside false narratives? How many children sensed hidden histories? How many parents feared disclosure? How many families balanced precariously on unspoken truths? Emily's case did not provide answers. It provided urgency. Chicago schools integrated discussions of identity, mental health, and family systems into curricula. Community centers hosted workshops. Support networks expanded. The tragedy reshaped policy. But policy cannot undo death. And progress cannot resurrect the lost. At night, when the city quieted, when traffic thinned and sirens receded, the echoes of Emily's story seemed to linger in the cold air, threading through alleyways, rising along brick facades, seeping into the foundations of homes where families slept beside secrets of their own. Her absence became a warning, a reminder, a plea. Tell the truth, before it demands to be told. Time does not heal all wounds. Some it simply teaches to ache in quieter ways. In Chicago, the echoes of Emily Carter's death softened, but they never disappeared. They settled into the rhythm of the city, into the low hum of memory that pulsed beneath everyday life. New headlines arrived. New tragedies replaced old ones. But her story remained, suspended between past and present, refusing to fade. The cold case unit that had reopened her file continued its work, inspired by the improbable breakthrough. Detectives revisited forgotten evidence. They re-examined dusty boxes. They listened again to voices long dismissed. Emily's case became proof that silence could be penetrated, that time was not always an accomplice to crime. But for those closest to the story, time only deepened the questions. What does justice mean when it arrives decades late? Does punishment balance loss? Can truth repair what it destroys? These questions haunted prosecutors, investigators, journalists, and families alike. In interviews, jurors described the emotional burden of the trial. Many admitted they struggled to sleep, replaying testimony, imagining the final moments of a young woman whose life ended before it fully began. Some sought counseling. Others avoided news entirely. A few returned to the courthouse weeks later, standing in the empty gallery, trying to make sense of the gravity they had carried. Justice, they realized, is not a conclusion. It is a beginning of grief, a beginning of reckoning, a beginning of responsibility. The city grappled with that responsibility, slowly, unevenly. Cold case funding increased. Forensic genealogy labs expanded. Partnerships formed between law enforcement and victim advocacy groups. New training programs emphasize trauma-informed investigation, recognizing that families carry histories far more complex than official records suggest. Emily's case became required study, not for its brutality, but for its psychology. It demonstrated how crimes rooted in intimacy are the hardest to detect, the easiest to misinterpret, and the most devastating when uncovered. It revealed how secrets, when interwoven with identity, produce fault lines capable of shattering entire families. Yet, even as institutions adapted, personal consequences remained unresolved. Michael Carter, after years of silence, eventually sought therapy. In quiet sessions, he unpacked memories he had buried beneath anger. He confronted the duality of loving his mother while resenting her choices. He wrestled with the impossible reality that his sister's killer shared her blood. Healing did not come in revelation. It came in fragments. A conversation.
A tear.
A memory revisited without flinching. Slowly, Michael began rebuilding a life not defined solely by loss. He married. He had children. He named his daughter Emily, not as tribute, but as reclamation, an act of defiance against erasure. Laura Carter never reached that place. Her days remained muted, constrained by remorse. She attended no support groups. She granted no interviews. She declined invitations to memorial services. She lived inside the narrow corridor of her own mind, where memory and regret converged endlessly. Neighbors described her as kind, reserved, distant. They saw an elderly woman walking alone, pausing often, gazing at nothing in particular, as if listening for a voice only she could hear. Perhaps she was. Perhaps Emily still spoke. In prison, Daniel Mercer aged rapidly. Years of alcohol abuse and emotional deterioration eroded his health. He developed heart problems, diabetes, neuropathy. His once volatile body slowed, subdued by the monotony of incarceration. Yet his mind remained active. He requested access to psychology texts. He read about trauma, attachment, fear conditioning, identity formation. He wrote pages of reflection, though he mailed none. Once, during a routine evaluation, a psychiatrist asked him if he believed redemption was possible. Daniel stared at the wall for a long time. "Redemption is for people who leave something behind," he said finally. "I left nothing." That statement lingered, unresolved, because he had left something. He had left devastation. And devastation, too, is a legacy. Emily's name endured in scholarship funds, advocacy initiatives, and educational programs. Her story became a narrative framework through which others explored their own histories. Her absence fostered presence elsewhere, shaping conversations, prompting confessions, preventing potential tragedies. But no amount of influence could replace her life. She would never graduate, never travel, never fall in love, never grow old. Those unlived moments hovered like ghosts. Every cold case solved illuminates a simple truth. Closure is a myth. There is only continuation. The continuation of grief. The continuation of memory. The continuation of responsibility. Chicago learned that lesson slowly, through decades of silence and a single eruption of truth. It learned that unresolved stories accumulate power, that buried facts ferment, that lies, however protective they seem, generate consequences beyond imagination. Emily Carter's story became a warning etched into the city's subconscious. Be careful what you hide. It will not remain hidden. Not forever. And when it emerges, it will reshape everything it touches. The city never truly sleeps. Even in its quietest hours, Chicago breathes, through the rumble of distant trains, the low murmur of traffic, the soft hiss of wind threading between buildings. And within that constant motion, memories drift, settling where they are least expected. On West Addison Street, the apartment building stands unchanged, its bricks bearing no visible trace of the horror once contained within. People pass beneath its windows without looking up. Life flows. Conversations echo. Laughter spills into the night. But for those who know, the air feels heavier there. They say certain places absorb what happens inside them, storing it deep within their walls. That energy never fully dissipates. It lingers, invisible but persistent, imprinting itself onto space itself. Emily's apartment became one such place. Tenants reported dreams they could not explain, sensations of unease without cause, a persistent awareness of absence. Some moved out within months, unable to articulate why. Others stayed, rationalizing the discomfort, convincing themselves it was coincidence, suggestion, imagination. But the mind does not need logic to feel. It needs memory. And memory had marked that space. Elsewhere in the city, detectives who had once worked Emily's case retired, carrying its unanswered questions into their private lives. Some confessed that her face followed them into sleep. Others admitted they measured every new investigation against that early failure. They learned something essential from her story. That patience is not enough. That time is not neutral. That unresolved questions do not fade, they deepen. And so, in the years following the case's resolution, Chicago's cold case unit became relentless. Files were reopened. Evidence was retested. Witnesses were recontacted. No lead was dismissed as too old, too small, too unlikely. Emily's story had proven that truth does not decay. It waits. In classrooms, criminology students studied the case as an example of investigative bias. How early assumptions narrow perception. How emotional cues influence judgment. How grief can disguise deception, even when unintentional. They learned to distrust simplicity. They learned to question normalcy. They learned that the most dangerous secrets hide behind the most ordinary lives. In community centers, families gathered to speak about identity, adoption, and the power of honesty. Parents shared fears. Children asked difficult questions. Conversations once postponed indefinitely now unfolded with urgency. The silence that had once protected now felt hazardous. Emily's legacy reshaped language itself. The phrase family secret acquired a darker tone. It no longer suggested harmless privacy. It implied potential catastrophe. And that shift rippled outward. But beneath societal change, individual pain persisted. Michael Carter, now a father, struggled with the weight of inherited trauma. He feared repeating patterns he barely understood. He obsessed over transparency, over communication, over emotional presence. He promised himself that his children would never need to search for truth in shadows. Every bedtime story became an act of resistance. Every honest answer, a small victory. Laura Carter, aging alone, faced a different reckoning. As her health declined, memories sharpened. The past returned with brutal clarity, unsoftened by time. Doctors noted elevated anxiety, chronic insomnia, episodes of dissociation. She lived suspended between regret and longing, haunted by the image of her daughter at 24, full of questions, reaching for understanding. In her final years, she began writing letters. Not to anyone, just to Emily. Hundreds of pages, never sent, never shared. In them, she confessed everything. The fear,
The shame.
the impossible choices, the desperate hope that silence might preserve stability. Each letter ended the same way. I am sorry. Whether apology brings relief is uncertain. But it brings recognition. And recognition is the first step toward forgiveness, even if forgiveness never arrives. In prison, Daniel Mercer approached the end of his life with a strange resignation. Illness confined him. His movements slowed.
His voice weakened.
He requested a chaplain. Their conversations were private, but the chaplain later described them as heavy with unresolved grief. Not for Emily. For himself. For the man he might have been. For the life he might have lived. Regret did not change his crime, but it altered its meaning. Violence, once impulsive, became deliberate memory. A permanent companion. In his final months, Daniel asked for a single thing. Not leniency. Not forgiveness. Not understanding. But anonymity. He wanted his name to vanish. To be forgotten. The request was denied. Because history does not grant erasure, only transformation. And his name would forever be tethered to hers. Emily Carter, a name once known only to family and friends, now etched into public memory. The story of her life and death became a modern parable, a cautionary tale, a whispered warning embedded within cultural consciousness. Truth, delayed, becomes tragedy. Silence, prolonged, becomes violence. And secrets, protected, become weapons. Yet within that bleak realization, a fragile hope emerged. That by confronting these patterns, society could disrupt them. That by speaking sooner, listening deeper, and questioning more courageously, future Emilys might live. Not every cold case ends with revelation. Not every truth arrives in time. But when it does, it reshapes the terrain of memory, carving pathways toward understanding, even as it exposes the depths of human frailty. Emily's story did not end with a verdict. It continues. In conversations. In classrooms. In families daring to speak. In communities learning to listen. And in the quiet spaces where memory lingers, urging the living to choose honesty over comfort, courage over concealment. In the end, what remains is not the crime, not the courtroom, not the headlines. What remains is the silence. A silence heavier than snow, denser than fog, clinging to the city long after the truth has surfaced, long after justice is spoken, long after the final gavel has fallen. Because some stories do not conclude. They dissolve. They seep into the cracks of memory, into the spaces between words, into the quiet moments when the world pauses just long enough for the past to breathe again. On winter nights, when Chicago's streets glow under amber streetlights and the wind slices between buildings, it is easy to imagine footsteps echoing on West Addison Street. A solitary figure climbing the stairs. A key turning softly in a lock. A door opening. And then nothing. No scream. No struggle. No warning. Only absence. Emily Carter does not exist as a body anymore. She exists as a question. A question that does not ask who. It asks how. How did a family's love become a weapon? How did silence become fatal? How did fear become stronger than conscience? How did a daughter searching for truth become a casualty of deception? These questions linger without resolution, because resolution implies peace. And peace is not guaranteed by answers. For every truth uncovered, another shadow emerges. For every secret revealed, another takes shape. The cold case was solved. But the cold did not leave. It simply changed form. It moved from files to memories. From evidence lockers to living rooms. From police databases to the subconscious of a city. It settled into collective awareness, shaping how people listened, how they spoke, how they hesitated before withholding truth. It whispered a warning. Some families learned it in time. Some did not. And so, Emily's story continues, carried forward not by detectives or journalists, but by ordinary people confronting extraordinary realizations in private spaces. A mother deciding to speak. A father choosing honesty. A child asking difficult questions. A family daring to unravel a story before it hardens into tragedy. These moments do not make headlines, but they change futures. In that sense, Emily did not die in vain. Her absence carved pathways toward awareness, empathy, and courage. Yet even that truth feels inadequate, because she should be alive. She should have grown older. She should have laughed louder. She should have lived longer. And no amount of meaning can compensate for that theft. On the anniversary of her death, candles still flicker outside the building. They glow against the cold brick, fragile and defiant, pushing back against darkness one flame at a time. Notes appear. Fresh flowers. Handwritten messages from strangers who never knew her, but feel they do. I will tell the truth. I will listen. I will remember. Memory becomes ritual. Ritual becomes resistance. Resistance becomes legacy. And legacy becomes the final form of justice. Not punishment. Not imprisonment. But transformation. Daniel Mercer's body will one day vanish into unmarked soil. His name will fade. His crimes will recede into archives, referenced by scholars, investigators, and students. Emily's name will remain. It will endure not because she died, but because her story forced the world to look inward, to question the safety of silence, to challenge the comfort of deception, to confront the fragile architecture of family narratives. In the quiet hours, when the city exhales and the streets empty, her story still moves through Chicago like a slow current, threading through brick and concrete, glass and steel, reminding the living of what happens when truth is delayed too long. And somewhere, beyond memory, beyond fear, beyond secrecy, perhaps Emily has finally found the clarity she sought. Perhaps she knows who she was. Perhaps she knows she was loved. Perhaps she knows that her voice, silenced in one moment of violence, has echoed across decades, reshaping countless lives. Or perhaps she exists only as absence, a void where a future should have been, a silence where laughter once waited, a cold space where warmth never arrived. And maybe that is the final truth, that not every story ends in resolution. Some end in echo, and those echoes, drifting through time, become warnings for those still listening. Because somewhere, right now, in a quiet apartment, a door is opening. And the difference between life and death is not strength, not speed, not luck. It is honesty. It is courage. It is the willingness to face the truth before it demands to be faced. Before silence becomes fatal. Before fear becomes violence. Before a life becomes a cold case. And when the city finally sleeps, when the lights dim and the streets empty, that truth lingers in the air, heavy and unresolved, whispering the name of a young woman whose story refuses to fade. Emily Carter. The night the truth finally began to surface did not announce itself with sirens or flashing lights, but with a single phone call that trembled through the silence of a modest apartment on the south side of Chicago, a voice barely above a whisper, carrying a weight that had been buried for 3 decades, a voice that said only 3 words before breaking apart completely. It was my brother. And in that moment, 30 years of unanswered questions shifted, the walls of denial cracked, and a cold case that had haunted a city since 1995 began to unravel, thread by fragile thread, into something far more devastating than anyone had imagined, because this was not the story of a stranger, not the story of a shadowy predator, not the story of an unknown monster lurking in the dark, but the story of a family that had built its entire existence on a lie so carefully constructed that even they had begun to believe it. The investigation reignited almost immediately, moving with a speed that contrasted violently against the decades of stillness that had come before, detectives returning to dusty boxes of evidence, reopening files yellowed by time, retracing steps that had long since faded from memory, and as they did, the city seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing that something monumental was about to break free from the past. The original crime scene photographs were pulled from storage, the grainy images once again projected onto sterile walls, revealing the same small, dimly lit apartment where everything had ended, the overturned chair, the shattered glass, the faint blood spatter that told a story of sudden violence and desperate struggle, details that once felt distant now screaming with renewed urgency, demanding to be understood. The victim, whose name had become a quiet echo in police archives, had been only 23, full of plans, restless with ambition, dreaming of escape from the narrow confines of a neighborhood that seemed determined to keep its children trapped, and yet tied fiercely to family, to loyalty, to a sense of belonging that would ultimately seal their fate. Friends had described them as cautious, thoughtful, someone who avoided conflict, someone who trusted too easily, especially those bound by blood, and it was this trust, investigators now believed, that had opened the door on that final night, letting the danger step inside without resistance. The brother, once an unremarkable figure in the background of the case, now stood at its center, a man who had lived an entire adult life under the protection of silence, building a career, raising children, attending family gatherings, sharing holidays and laughter with the very people who had unknowingly shielded him from justice. His alibi in 1995 had been simple, ordinary, supported by relatives who insisted he had been home, asleep, miles away from the crime scene, and in the absence of any physical evidence to contradict them, investigators had been forced to let him go, marking the file with a single word that would linger like a curse: unsolved. But time changes things. Science evolves. Memories weaken. Loyalties erode. And in 2025, a routine re-examination of old cases brought the file back into the light, placing it into the hands of a team that specialized in forgotten crimes, detectives trained to see what others had missed, to question what had once been accepted as truth. They noticed inconsistencies in the original statements, subtle contradictions between family members, timelines that did not quite align, gaps that suggested more than simple forgetfulness, and when they began to push, gently at first, then with increasing pressure, the carefully built structure of lies began to wobble. It was the youngest sister who cracked first, worn down by years of suppressed guilt, haunted by fragments of memory that refused to fade, a single image repeating itself in her dreams. Her brother standing in the doorway late at night, his clothes damp, his hands shaking, his eyes burning with panic, and a whispered command she had never dared to disobey: "Don't say anything." For 30 years she had carried that moment alone, telling herself it meant nothing, convincing herself that she had imagined it, until the weight became unbearable, until the past demanded to be acknowledged, until silence itself felt like a form of violence. Her statement reopened everything. Investigators returned to the family home, searched through decades-old storage boxes, and there, hidden beneath layers of forgotten belongings, they discovered items that should never have existed: a jacket matching the one described by witnesses in 1995, still bearing faint traces of blood, a pair of gloves stiff with age, and a knife wrapped carefully in yellowed newspaper dated just days after the murder. Forensic testing confirmed what Fear had long suspected. The blood belonged to the victim. The fingerprints, though partially degraded, matched the brother. The lie, once impenetrable, collapsed in an instant. The arrest came quietly, without spectacle: a simple knock on a suburban door, a pair of handcuffs, a stunned family watching as the man they thought they knew was led away in silence. There was no dramatic confession, no tearful breakdown, only a hollow stare, a face drained of color, a body that seemed to shrink under the sudden weight of exposure. In the interrogation room, he spoke in fragments, half-finished sentences, evasive explanations that shifted and twisted under scrutiny, but the evidence was relentless, closing in from every side, until denial became impossible, until the truth forced itself into the open like a scream finally released after decades of suffocation. He claimed it had been an accident, a heated argument spiraling out of control, a moment of rage that exploded into irreversible tragedy, but the physical evidence told a different story, one of deliberate force, of sustained assault, of a struggle that lasted far longer than a single impulsive blow. Investigators reconstructed the final minutes with chilling precision: the confrontation, the raised voices, the sudden lunge, the desperate attempt to flee, the final, fatal strike that ended everything in a heartbeat. It was not an accident. It was a choice. As the case moved toward trial, the city watched in stunned disbelief, grappling with the realization that the monster they had feared for so long had never been an unknown shadow, but a familiar face, a neighbor, a co-worker, a man who had stood in line at grocery stores, waved politely to strangers, and lived undetected among them. The revelation shattered the community's sense of safety, forcing an uncomfortable reckoning with the idea that evil does not always announce itself, that sometimes it wears the mask of normality so convincingly that even those closest to it fail to see what lies beneath. For the victim's surviving relatives, the reopening of the case reopened wounds that had never truly healed, dragging grief back into the present with brutal force. They had learned to live with uncertainty, to accept the absence of answers as a permanent condition, and now, faced with the raw clarity of truth, they were forced to relive the loss in its most vivid form. Court hearings became unbearable rituals, each piece of evidence a fresh reminder of what had been taken, each testimony a blade cutting through carefully constructed emotional defenses, leaving nothing but exposed nerve and silent rage. The trial unfolded with relentless intensity, prosecutors laying out the narrative step by step, connecting the dots between motive, opportunity, and physical proof, while the defense struggled to counter a case built on forensic certainty and decades of suppressed testimony. Jurors sat frozen, absorbing details that seemed more fitting for a dark novel than a suburban courtroom, and as the days passed, the weight of the story pressed heavily upon everyone present, a collective recognition that they were witnessing not just the resolution of a crime, but the collapse of a family's carefully guarded illusion. When the verdict finally came, it landed with a quiet finality that echoed far beyond the courtroom walls, guilty on all counts. There was no outburst, no dramatic reaction, only a long, heavy silence, followed by the subdued sounds of restrained emotion, tears quickly wiped away, hands clasped tightly in laps, heads bowed in exhausted relief. Justice, delayed for 30 years, had at last arrived, but it came bearing the unmistakable scars of time, unable to restore what had been lost, able only to acknowledge it. Yet even as the legal chapter closed, the emotional aftermath stretched endlessly forward, a reminder that some wounds do not heal, they merely change shape. The community struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the killer he had proven to be, replaying past interactions in their minds, searching for signs they might have missed, moments that might now reveal hidden meaning. The family, fractured beyond repair, faced a future defined by absence and betrayal, bound together only by shared shock and irrevocable loss. And in the quiet that followed, as the headlines faded and public attention drifted elsewhere, the case left behind a lingering question, one that refused to settle, one that whispered through the empty hallways of memory. How many truths remain buried, waiting for the right moment, the right fracture, the right spark of courage to finally break free? Because in every community, in every family, there exist stories carefully concealed, secrets protected by love, fear, and loyalty, and sometimes those secrets are the very things that keep justice at bay. The Chicago 1995 cold case was solved, the family's secret exposed, the 30-year lie dismantled piece by piece, but its echo continues, a cautionary reminder that time does not erase truth, it merely delays its arrival, and when it finally comes, it does so with a force capable of reshaping lives, rewriting histories, and revealing, in the harshest possible light, the fragile line between who we believe we are and who we truly become when no one is watching. The sentence was delivered in a courtroom thick with silence, each word falling like a stone into deep water, ripples spreading across faces drained of color, across hands clenched so tightly that fingernails cut into skin, across a room that had become the final stage of a tragedy 30 years in the making. Life imprisonment. No parole. No appeal to mercy. No escape from the gravity of what had been done. And yet, as the gavel struck and the proceedings formally ended, there was no sense of triumph, no feeling of victory, only a hollow stillness, a collective awareness that justice, when it arrives so late, does not heal, it only confirms the depth of the wound. Outside, the winter air of Chicago pressed against the courthouse steps, sharp and unforgiving, as reporters gathered, microphones raised, cameras flashing, voices overlapping in a frantic attempt to capture reactions, to extract meaning, to condense 3 decades of pain into a handful of usable sound bites. Family members walked past without speaking, eyes fixed straight ahead, bodies moving on instinct alone, their faces marked not by anger, but by exhaustion, the kind that settles into bones and refuses to leave. For them, the end of the trial was not closure. It was the beginning of a new reckoning. The victim's mother, now aged far beyond her years, paused briefly before the steps, her breath visible in the cold, her gaze unfocused, as though she were looking through the present and into a past that refused to fade. She spoke only once, her voice steady but thin, saying that she had waited half her life to hear the truth, and that now, having finally heard it, she wished more than anything that she could unhear it, that she could return to the time when uncertainty still allowed room for hope. Because certainty, she said, was heavier. It stayed. In the days that followed, the city tried to move on, but the story clung stubbornly to its consciousness, replayed on late-night news, dissected in online forums, debated in quiet conversations at kitchen tables and crowded bus stops. People who had lived in the same neighborhoods in 1995 began to share their memories, fragments of ordinary life suddenly recast in a darker light. A man seen walking late at night, a heated argument overheard through thin apartment walls, a family that seemed too eager to insist on innocence. Hindsight transformed the mundane into potential evidence, and though the case was officially closed, the public investigation had only just begun. Former detectives who had worked the original case revisited their notes, confronting uncomfortable questions about missed opportunities, about assumptions that had gone unchallenged, about the fragile nature of truth when it is filtered through loyalty and fear. Some defended their decisions, pointing to the limitations of forensic technology at the time, the absence of clear witnesses, the solid-seeming alibis that had protected the suspect. Others admitted regret, acknowledging that perhaps the pressure of overwhelming caseloads and the urgency of newer crimes had pushed older ones into the shadows. It was an uneasy reckoning, one that underscored the imperfect nature of justice and the devastating cost of its delays. The reopened case also reignited conversations about the countless other cold cases still waiting in silence, their victims' names fading from public memory, their families trapped in a limbo that stretched endlessly forward. Advocacy groups seized the moment, calling for increased funding, for renewed investigative efforts, for the systematic re-examination of unsolved crimes using modern forensic tools. They spoke of hope, of possibility, of the idea that even the oldest secrets could still be unearthed, and yet, beneath their optimism lay an unspoken truth. For many, time had already stolen too much. Within the fractured family of the convicted man, the fallout was devastating. Relationships collapsed under the weight of betrayal, siblings cut off contact, parents withdrew into silence, children struggled to reconcile the father they loved with the killer the world now knew. Therapy sessions replaced holiday gatherings, strained phone calls replaced warm embraces, and a legacy of shame settled heavily over generations that had done nothing to deserve it. The lie that had once protected them now threatened to consume them, proving that secrecy, no matter how well-intentioned, always extracts its price. In quiet moments, the youngest sister, whose confession had set everything in motion, wrestled with conflicting emotions, relief and guilt, liberation and grief, pride and shame, each colliding violently within her. She had done the right thing. She knew that. And yet, the cost of truth felt almost unbearable. She had lost her brother, not just to prison, but to the irreversible knowledge of who he truly was. She had lost her family as she once understood it. And she had gained, in return, only the fragile comfort of knowing that the silence was finally broken. The apartment where the crime had occurred no longer existed, demolished years earlier, replaced by a glass and steel condominium that gleamed under the city lights, its polished surfaces betraying no hint of the violence that had once stained that ground. New residents walked its halls unaware, carrying groceries, walking dogs, laughing into their phones, living lives untouched by the echoes beneath their feet. And yet, for those who knew the story, the location remained sacred and cursed all at once, a physical reminder that tragedy does not vanish, it is merely built over. Late at night, long after the news vans had left and the headlines had shifted to fresher horrors, the city returned to its restless rhythm, trains rattling through dark tunnels, distant sirens cutting through the hum of traffic, neon signs flickering against wet pavement. Somewhere within that endless motion, the memory of a single life lost in 1995 continued to ripple outward, shaping decisions, haunting dreams, altering destinies in ways that could never fully be traced. The case became a symbol, invoked in discussions of criminal justice reform, forensic advancement, and the psychological toll of unresolved trauma. It was cited in training sessions for young detectives, used as a cautionary tale about the dangers of complacency, the necessity of skepticism, the importance of perseverance. It served as proof that even the most carefully hidden truths could eventually be uncovered, but also as a reminder that justice delayed carries consequences far beyond the courtroom. And yet, despite all that had been revealed, one final mystery lingered, subtle but persistent: the precise moment when the lie had truly begun. Was it in the seconds after the fatal blow, when panic overtook reason? Was it in the hurried disposal of evidence, the whispered instructions, the coordinated alibi? Or had it started long before, in the unspoken resentments, the simmering rivalries, the fragile dynamics of a family strained by circumstance? No verdict could answer that. No sentence could untangle it. The roots of violence, like the roots of silence, often run too deep to be fully exposed. As the years move forward, as new stories claim attention and new tragedies dominate the news cycle, the Chicago 1995 cold case will slowly recede into history, archived, cataloged, remembered only by those directly touched by its shadow. But its lessons remain, etched into the collective memory of a city that learned, too late, the cost of believing that time alone can bury the truth. Because somewhere, in some quiet room, another phone may be ringing. Another voice may be trembling. Another secret, heavy with decades of silence, may be poised on the edge of revelation. And when it finally falls, it will remind us once again that the past is never truly past, that every lie is a delayed confession, and that every cold case is merely a story waiting for the courage, the science, and the unbearable necessity of truth to bring it back into the light. Years would pass, and yet the shadow of that winter trial would never truly lift, lingering in the margins of daily life, resurfacing in unexpected ways, in the brief hesitation before answering a late-night phone call, in the uneasy silence that followed the mention of an old address, in the instinctive tightening of the chest when a news alert flashed across a glowing screen. The story had ended in the eyes of the law, but in the minds of those who lived through it, it continued to unfold, chapter after chapter, an echo that refused to fade, a reminder that some endings are merely transformations, shifting pain from one form into another. For the detectives who had reopened the case, the victory was bittersweet, a moment of professional validation tempered by the knowledge of how much time had been lost, how many chances had slipped through the cracks of human error and technological limitation. They returned to their offices the day after the sentencing, surrounded by shelves stacked high with unsolved files, each one a silent plea, each one carrying its own invisible clock, counting down the years until memories dissolved, witnesses disappeared, and evidence decayed beyond recognition. The Chicago 1995 cold case had been solved, yes, but it stood as a stark outlier in a sea of unresolved tragedy, a single light in a vast and restless dark. They spoke quietly among themselves about the cases that haunted them most, the ones that kept them awake long after midnight, the ones they replayed in their minds during sleepless hours, searching for overlooked details, for hidden connections, for that elusive thread capable of unraveling an entire mystery. And in those conversations, the solved case became both inspiration and torment, proof that persistence could break even the thickest silence, and evidence that persistence alone was never enough. Chance, timing, and the fragile courage of human confession all played their roles, unpredictable and uncontrollable. The youngest sister, now a reluctant symbol of truth's painful power, withdrew from public view, retreating into a life defined by careful anonymity. She moved to a different city, changed her routines, avoided the familiar streets that carried too many memories. But distance offered no real escape. In quiet moments, she still saw her brother's face as it had been in childhood, still heard the laughter that once filled their shared rooms, still felt the warmth of a bond that had existed long before violence and fear tore it apart. The truth she had spoken freed her, and yet it also bound her to a grief that had no clear outlet, a grief that belonged to no single moment, but to an entire lifetime. In therapy rooms dimly lit and heavy with the scent of disinfectant, she learned to name her emotions, to separate responsibility from blame, to accept that courage often arrives too late to save everyone, but never too late to matter. Still, each breakthrough brought new questions, new layers of sorrow, new realizations about the ways in which love can become a weapon when twisted by desperation and denial. She began to understand that her silence, though devastating in its consequences, had been born from the same instinct that drives so many to hide the truth, the desperate hope that by refusing to acknowledge reality, one might somehow reshape it. The children of the convicted man grew into adulthood under the weight of an inherited notoriety they had never chosen, navigating a world that saw them not as individuals, but as extensions of a crime committed before some of them had even been born. In classrooms and workplaces, whispers followed them, subtle glances lingered, unspoken judgments hovered just beneath polite conversation. They learned early to guard their last name, to offer vague answers when asked about family, to construct carefully edited versions of their past that omitted the most painful details. And yet, despite their efforts, the truth always seemed to find its way back, seeping through the smallest cracks, reminding them that legacy is not something one can easily outrun. Some chose to confront it directly, speaking publicly about the impact of their father's actions, about the complicated love they still felt, about the impossible task of reconciling cherished memories with undeniable horror. Others chose silence, building new identities in distant places, hoping that time and distance might finally loosen the grip of a story that had claimed too much already. But in every path they took, the past traveled with them, a constant companion, shaping their choices, their fears, their understanding of trust. Across the city, community organizations used the case as a catalyst for dialogue, hosting forums on violence prevention, family dynamics, and the corrosive effects of secrecy. Survivors of other unsolved crimes found new courage in its resolution, stepping forward with fragments of memory they had long suppressed, offering information that might, at last, push other investigations forward. Some of those leads led nowhere, dissolving under scrutiny, but others sparked renewed hope, small flames flickering to life in the vast darkness of unresolved loss. The ripple effect extended beyond Chicago, drawing national attention, prompting law enforcement agencies in other cities to re-examine their own cold cases, to invest in updated forensic testing, to create specialized units dedicated to the pursuit of long-buried truth. And yet, for every success story that emerged, countless others remained frozen in time, their victims' names etched into databases but absent from headlines, their families still waiting for a knock on the door that might never come. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city lay suspended between darkness and light, the unanswered questions seemed to gather, hovering in that fragile space where hope and despair coexist. What if the sister had spoken sooner? What if the evidence had been discovered earlier? What if the original investigation had pushed harder, doubted more, trusted less? These questions, endlessly circular, offered no comfort, only the cold reassurance that the past, once lived, cannot be rewritten. And yet, within that same stillness, there existed a fragile sense of possibility, a recognition that truth, though delayed, had ultimately prevailed, that the lie, however carefully constructed, had not survived the slow erosion of time. It was a reminder that even in the most entrenched silence, cracks eventually form, and through those cracks, light finds its way. The story of the Chicago 1995 cold case became a cautionary legend, whispered in police academies, referenced in academic studies, dissected in true crime podcasts and late-night documentaries. But beyond the analysis and commentary, beyond the headlines and debates, it remained, at its core, a profoundly human tragedy, a collision of love and fear, loyalty and betrayal, impulse and consequence, playing out in ordinary rooms among ordinary people, proving once again that the most devastating crimes do not always emerge from extraordinary circumstances, but from the fragile complexities of everyday life. And so, even as the years continue to turn, even as new generations grow up unaware of the events that once shook the city, the echo persists, carried in the memories of those who lived it, in the lessons absorbed by those who study it, in the quiet resolve of those who refuse to let it be forgotten. Because forgetting, in the end, is the final injustice, the last betrayal of lives already lost. Somewhere, another family may be standing at the edge of truth, weighed down by a secret too heavy to bear, torn between loyalty and conscience, love and accountability. Somewhere, another investigator may be sifting through brittle files, chasing the faintest hint of a lead, driven by the stubborn belief that every story deserves an ending. And somewhere, another voice may be gathering the courage to speak, to finally break a silence that has endured for decades. When that moment comes, as it inevitably will, it will carry the same quiet thunder that reshaped Chicago's understanding of its own past, reminding us all that time does not extinguish guilt, that memory does not truly fade, and that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, waits patiently for its moment to rise, unyielding, undeniable, and forever transformative.